Sunday Talks with the Marshmallow Man.
Hey, I'm Ossie from Three Monkeys Solderless, home of the world's best cables for your pedal board. Go get some. threemonkeysolderless.com, and we've got a sale going on, so get to the site before it runs out. Get yourself some cables. All right, so we're back. It's the Sundays with the Marshmallow Man, so to speak, where we're going to be talking about guitars and amplifiers and physics and tone and goofy stuff and just having fun and baloneying, if that's a word. All right, so as usual, we always start off with reading some comments and then seeing where that takes us. I do have a topic I wanted to talk about, which is related to some of the things we were talking about last week, related to impedance, right? So tone and impedance. Last time we were talking about distortion. So I think today we're going to talk a little bit about impedance, which is kind of interesting stuff. So let's start with the comments, right? Let's go right into the unread comments on the YouTubes. All right, so we got the first comment, and I read everything, right? So this is Jim Olson. Jim, the sound is pretty damn nice. Nice work. Well, thank you. It's hard to listen to you describe it, though, because you say right after just about every sentence. That's a common habit I hear in boardrooms now, too, and it's very distracting. Right. Sorry. I'm sorry if you find it distracting. I'm sure that, some people, they look at this piece of hair hanging in my face. They're like, I can't listen to you with that hair hanging down. Why don't you comb it? So I appreciate the kind comments. I try to do what I can, but I am who I am, and I'm comfortable with it at this point. So thanks for the kind words. I'll take those, and we'll be constructive. Yeah, so that was on Browntown Level 2, the amp. So thanks for the comment, Jim. Next, we've got Mott Rock. All right, so Mott Rock is asking a question which was related to aux boxes. All right, so this is really cool. I think this is what got me into where we're going. This is really cool. So I have a quick question. I have one aux, which is, for that you don't know, it's a Universal Audio aux box cabinet load and speaker simulator, which is what I use for recording, my clips and stuff, because it, takes all the guesswork out of miking stuff and moving mics and stuff like that. So it says, I have heard that Ed went 8 into 16 ohms, right? So 8 ohms out of the amp, I'm assuming, into a 16 ohm cabinet. Have you done that? And can you do that with the aux? Can that damage either the amp or the aux? All right, so this is a very, very complicated question, right? And one that I'm not prepared to answer with an absolute, right? Because this is sort of the stuff where not everything is equal, and there's literally, you could write a PhD thesis on just this question. But suffice it to say that he heard that it did go upward matching, right? So that would be, this is what we call an upward match, a lower ohm into a higher ohm cabinet, right? So yes, I've done that, and it can be done. And what you end up doing is dealing with what we had spoken about a long time ago, which is reflected impedance, right? Between, let's say, the tubes, the power tubes of this amplifier and your speaker cabinet, you have the output transformer, right? Which is a bunch of wire that's wound around each other with an iron core that creates communications, right? And the turns ratio, as in how many turns of the secondary versus the primary, is how you would describe the amplifier or rather the transformer in terms of what it's meant to do, right? So, and for instance, in an EL34 amplifier, right, hooked into a 16 ohm cabinet, there is kind of a mathematical formula for determining what the EL34s would be loaded at to sound in a particular way, which is what the engineers designed it to be, right? And what you would have to see on the other side to reach 16 ohms, right? So knowing those two things, that you would want to run these EL34s at, let's say, 1.5K would be the load on them. And on the other side of this mystery box transformer, you would want to see 16 ohms. So to get from 1.5 to 16 ohms, right, there would be a ratio. That's your turns ratio, right? So a transformer itself doesn't really care. It's just a translator, right? It doesn't, it's not like I am a 100 watt EL34 1.5K transformer. No, because when you change the situation, let's say by using another tap on your output transformer, which he's referring to going 16 instead of 8 into 16, you change that reflection, that ratio, right? And you end up, in a sense, going up or down. Let's say if 8 is your, let's do this way better. Let's say you wanted to go 8 ohms. So 8 ohms into 8 ohms. If you were to go one way up, doubling it into 16 ohms, or halving it 16 ohms, you would either double or half the reflected impedance back to the power tubes. Now, the power tubes may be expecting a particular curve, load curve, right? And basically related to how you biased the amplifier, all right? Now, this is very simplistic, and we're going to talk a little bit more in depth about this later, but suffice to say, if your amplifier is on the edge of exploding, right, that you have a bias way too hot, or it's some way weakened, and you do a mismatch one way or the other, you could cause problems. In my experience, that generally does not happen. I have personally yet to blow up anything with a simple mismatch like that. Now, generally speaking, they consider it to be, some people would say, you're picking your poison here. An upward mismatch being safer. I'm probably thinking, yeah, there's good reasons why an upward mismatch, 8 into 16, would be a better match, right? Because you would basically have a limit of the power excursion of the power tubes, right? They tend to make less power when they're put into a larger load. Conversely, when they're put into a lower load, they tend to try to make more power. But there are other advantages that happen into a lower, and there are other disadvantages that happen when you're into a higher. So there's really no yes or no. Can you do that with the aux? Yes, you can. I mean, it does have an impedance selector on the back, so you can change that. Now, that's up to the aux engineers, whether it will damage the aux, right? Like, how did they set it up? What is the actual loading? Is it reactive? Is it non-reactive? Does it respond the same way as a speaker cabinet does to impedance mismatching, right? Because a speaker cabinet is what I would call a live specimen. Whereas like a static load box, let's say like a Jose load, which has resistors in it, non-reactive, is static, right? So for instance, if you were to plug an amplifier into a resistor, it's going to put out more wattage in some cases than a speaker cabinet with the same ohm rating, due to the fact that speakers tend to have what phenomenon known as climbing impedance, right? That as sort of like the sound pressures build up in the cabinet and as more power is put to them, the coil in the speaker itself tends to present more impedance back to the amp and then limit the power excursion of the power amp, right? So this is sort of like why the real world is very difficult to simulate in impulse responses, right? You could sort of say, well, this is going to happen or that's going to happen, and we can kind of model this or kind of model that. But I've always said there's not enough computing power in the universe to really actually completely model the effect of a burp. There just isn't, right? It's sort of like something that is smaller than the whole can contain the whole. It just doesn't work out in reality. So yeah, it can possibly damage the amp or the aux. So there's no simple solution to this, but we'll go more in depth on that because it's interesting later. So sorry there isn't a more definitive answer for you, but you can try it at your own risk. I would watch things carefully to make sure that nothing is sort of getting out of spec. The tubes aren't getting red hot, or the load itself isn't really getting red hot, right? And then also contact Universal Audio and see what they say about their durability of their load that's inside the box. All right, so going on. PVT Grips asks, great video, Ossie. Well, thank you. How do I use my 100-watt plexi copy as a slave if it doesn't have a FX loop? So I'm assuming that means you're using it as, I'll go for both, if it's the brain or if it's the power amp. You can use it as the power amp by going into the front of the amplifier, being that you have a line level signal presented to it. I think that way is a little bit out of control, so I tend to stay away from it. I find that, the best way to slave is to use the second amp as a power amplifier, and that would be inserting into the power amp, right? Skipping all the pre's that would add a lot of gain, right? And we talked about gain before, a lot of signal gain, which could create, unwanted distortions in the signal, right? But if you don't have an FX loop, generally speaking, it's not going to be the bestest solution that you've got. All right, so we've gone we've gone 11 minutes, and I don't think I've said right once, maybe twice. That's twice. Or is it 3 times? All right, so we're keeping it down to a minimum here. All right, so here we go. Hey, I just said it again. Whose amp was this? Referring to the Marshall, right? My Jose. As I said, can't answer that. One day, it will never be revealed. I might actually sell the Jose soon. I'm thinking about it because I don't really use it much, and I kind of digging this thing more. So I'm thinking about maybe getting rid of the Jose, but I have no idea what something like that would even go for anymore. I mean, you never see another one. But anyway, let's move on. All right, so this is from Johnny Roggio. This is related to the Van Halen 1 pickup comparison. There were a few of those I did, which I ran a bunch of different, the usual suspects, so to speak, the PAFs, the DiMarzio Super Distortions, Super 2s, Mighty Mites, Vintage New, PAFs, Duncans, all that stuff. So it said a most excellent and intuitive assessment. I agree with so many thoughts here. Well, thanks for that. Appreciate it, Johnny. I have several pickups, and a lot of times I prefer the DiMarzio Super Distortion. Gives that sizzle. It does, for sure. I use a 250K pot for that, like Ed must have had in his Strat, possibly. Quick question. What is your reverb settings? Sounds amazing. Well, some of the reverb, I just use the reverb that's available in the aux unit, which is, like I said, what I use for the mic sound. And that's basically like an EMT plate, right? It's just a simulation of an EMT plate. And there's so many different, reverbs or different companies that you can get that do simulations of EMT plate. If it's in the box, so to speak, in GarageBand, a lot of times I'll just use the greenback setting, right, with no reverb, just dry one greenback from the aux, and I'll use IK Multimedia's Sunset Sound, right, which has all the reverb sort of like algorithms from Sunset Sound Studios, which would include their chambers, the live chambers, as well as a couple of different EMTs and springs. So, but I believe on that I was just using the UA, Universal Audio EMT simulation from the aux. Okay, moving on. Buzzed Aldrich. What's up, man? Hey, Ozzy, on the subject of pickup comparisons, have you ever wound your own pickups? Yes. I have wound about 15 using 42 gauge plain enamel wire and all different magnets you could think of. Ohm rating between 7 and 9.5K. I found any higher loses the PF sound and becomes too hot sounding. I know this would open up another whole can of worms. There is nothing really scientific about the way I do it. They've all sounded different, and they all actually sound different in different guitars. You never know. You may find exactly what you're looking for. After all, that's what Eddie did, at least in the beginning. I mean, yeah. I mean, you've sort of like opened up the can of worms that we've already like sort of like spilled on the floor, which is, the physics of the world, which don't allow for, repetition very easily, right, of processes or of materials. Repetition is something that's very difficult to do in the real world. There's too many variances. So I've wound pickups for sure. I bought actually this little, I was down at Mojo Tone, a while ago, and Lindy's winder was working there at that time, right? And that was Dan Bartlett, I think was his name. Anyway, he had a machine down there that he was showing me, and I was kind of looking because I was interested in winding these things, and I was looking at the machine that he used to wind pickups on specifically, and it was really interesting, right? It was like this cam driven operation that would the cam basically would allow for the bobbin to move back and forth, so you could get a even kind of wind across the coils, right? Because when you're winding on a bobbin, you kind of got to spread the wire around evenly on the coils, right? And how it all lays down starts to give you a lot of the inductance and reactance qualities of a pickup, right? Because we have so many things. You wind up something 9.5K or 7.5K. That is a known quantity of length of wire. And this goes into what we're going to talk about later with impedance, right? And matching. So when a known quantity of wire will produce a known impedance, generally speaking, given that you don't stretch it when you're winding it, and that it's a consistent wire in terms of its production when it is drawn and thinned into the gauge that you get. So then the real test becomes how the wire lays down in the bobbin. Is it uniform? Is it overlapping? Is it scatterwound? All of those things affect the other qualities, the capacitance a little bit, inductance and reactance, though big. So I could say that if you're wiring these things or winding these things by hand, every one of them is going to come out different. And if, Seymour was winding things by hand, or Eddie was, or whatever you want to believe, then the variations are enormous. Even when you're dealing with a machine wound, like a Lasona machine, or this machine I saw down at Mojo, there's going to be some variance to it, right? This is just the world is. Sometimes the wire, gets caught on something and it changes the way it lays down, or it finds a valley that wasn't there in the other one and lays in that valley, or it gets stuck in a valley. All right. So it's difficult to know, or difficult to repeat the process over and over again. It really isn't. So there's really nothing scientific about the way I do it. Well, you're doing it somewhat scientifically, right? Because you're kind of, science is about trial and error. So yeah, you're doing it scientifically. You're kind of, looking for a result and comparing results. They've all sounded different. They actually sound different guitars. Well, different guitars, right? If you mate something up, every guitar will have a resonant frequency, right? Based upon a million variables. How the strings were made that day, right? How old they are, how you pluck them, where on the string you pluck them, the wood that it's made of, how it sympathetically vibrates or attenuates frequencies in the guitar, how the body gives off, right? But it's basically, all right, that is energy. Plain and simple. That's energy, right? And that energy has to be dissipated, right? That energy is dissipated by vibrating the air. That's one way that the string decays, right? The string only decays when the energy is dissipated. It vibrates the air, which takes, energy to do. It vibrates the body, which takes energy to do. If the body is made of different materials, that energy in certain frequencies might dissipate quicker or shorter, or, in a different type of a pattern. So yeah, every guitar is going to be a little different. And if you can find the pickup that you think works well in the guitar, that's great. But you may take that pickup out of that guitar and put it in another one and not like it. I've had that happen more than once, for sure. It happens all the time. So it's always like a guess of what, of what's sort of going on. I mean, like in this guitar, I'm liking the custom for it, but I did put a Tom Holmes PAF in it because that clip, right? That clip that was that we did the comparison of a couple weeks ago, and I've got more of those to share with you that are even scarier close, was done with an old PAF. So I'm like, I need something. So I went through my box and dug out some old Tom Holmes that I got one set from him or in like the 90s. So I put that in. It's like a 9 point something K. And it sounds pretty cool, I think, with the amp again, right? Has a little bit more articulation. It's got good output. So it's yeah. What the hell were we doing? We weren't supposed to be playing guitar. Turn this down. Anyway, yeah. So matching the pickup to the guitar is important. I actually think this PF works pretty good with this guitar, so it may stay in there for a little bit. Oop! I bumped the screen. Sorry about that. If you guys are getting dizzy. All right. So now in response to this, yeah, I'm definitely going to be, always trying pickups. And sometimes I wind my own. I'll bring out some pickups one day that I wound, which were like Mighty Mite copies, BAF copies. I bought this motherbucker, right, that had Mighty Mite that had 3 coils in it. So it had, 3 magnets in it. So I made 3 pickups with those 3 magnets. So that was kind of cool. All right, so These Go to 11 actually responded to Buzzed All Drink. So let's see what These Go to 11 has to say. The pickup on Van Halen 1 was an old Gibson PAF that Ed wax potted himself. Ed did not get into the hotter pickups until many years later when he started using the Floyd Rose on his guitars. This is just not my opinion, but what came out of Eddie's own mouth when he did the Jazz Obrecht audio interviews in 78, 77. There's more to this comment. A lot of his secrets in those interviews. Yeah, I mean, I have a bunch of books that have the interviews with Rosen, right? I do find Eddie to be contradictory, though. I mean, he often says stuff that he denied previously or conflicts with things he said before. And I'll tell you also, from having worked with musicians, they don't have the greatest memories all the time for what they were doing, because there's a lot of extracurricular activities going on around. And, when you're trying stuff, it's difficult to remember whether, did I use that pickup or this pickup? And some of it may be, I just don't want anybody to know, right? I mean, we have things where, Eddie said that he painted the Bumblebee, right? And that it was just dry in time for the show, for the photograph for Van Halen 2's album cover, right? And that he had just finished painting it. He didn't paint that guitar, right? So there's a lot of times that he just says stuff that doesn't really add up. So I appreciate the information of what was in the Jazz Obrecht audio interviews. I think that's all important. But in my thinking, I don't discount anything. So I am not discounting what you said at all, or that Eddie was telling the truth there. I just say it may not be, right? And then I consider all possibilities. That's just the way I go. Because if Dogma was accurate, we would already have gotten there. So let's keep going. I've got Tanner Jordan. Oh, sorry. Tanner Jordan. Oh, yeah. He commented like a week ago, last week. What I was trying to say is that we have access to the mic diagram from the first and second albums, and there's nothing written about DI coming from Ed's amp. There is a DI note written next to Mike's amp, as you would expect. I have a feeling the weekend that Patty mentions in the Sunset interviews, and Patty was sort of like Don's assistant, and Patty worked with Prince mostly and was like sort of a staple of Sunset Sound for those that haven't seen those videos. Patty mentions in the Sunset interviews where Don, being Landy, remixed Everything Alone. Yes, I saw that one. And that is where the magic happened. I have no doubt that is 50% of the equation. No doubt. None whatsoever. That Don Landy is the reason why Van Halen sounds why it did. Absolutely. I mean, when I listen to the mic overheads, from that, basically the end of Eruption or Eruption, what Don was doing was really magical. He goes on to say, I have a friend who has access to the unmixed multi-track of Running with the Devil, and there is no distortion on the bass. Okay, all of that bass sound came in post. No distortion on the bass. I don't know. I think maybe this message got garbled by spell check, maybe. Is the bass... I don't think we were just... That makes sense. No distortion on the bass. I'm not the best when it comes to like understanding what people say, right? Because I got issues, right? I'm dyslexic really badly. My brain will really make things look the way it wants to. It does a lot of interesting things, but it does a lot of things I wish it didn't. But anyway, enough about me. I have a feeling the weekend Patty mentions the Sunset interview where Don remixed Everything Alone Is Where the Magic Happened. So no DI, that there was magic in the mix. Yeah, I mean, like we were talking about with like ways of creating an extended frequency response, right? Which is what we hear in the album itself. It's beyond what a Celestian's capable of doing, right? That can be done through tricks of compression, right? Using, like, let's say this trick where you're using an EQ to send just high end information to a compressor, like an LA2A. Set the LA2 up to just deal with high frequencies, squash the ever-living shit out of it until it gets squared off and sounds distorted, which in a sense adds more of that high frequency character, and then send that back into a boost and bring that back up to level, and then you're going to have this crisp top end. Now that was done a lot, from what I understand, on vocals, right, to give that vocal sound this sheen to it, right, like you would hear on a Bee Gees album or on, some of the definitely some of some of oh my god, I'm losing my mind. But anyway, Doobie Brothers, right? That sound of the Doobie Brothers is all, Don, right? And the Doobie Brothers sound, like the way that he sort of gave treatment to the vocals and things like that, reminds me a lot of how he gave treatment to Ed's guitar sound, right? Like it's almost like Ed's guitar sound was the star of the show, so therefore we're going to make it get the treatment that I did to like the vocal tracks on the on those other albums, right? Where it was sort of like, the Doobies just had these such smooth, silky, yet airy cutting vocal tracks, right? With swirl happening. It was just beautiful. And we'll talk about that kind of like thing in a bit too, right? Why I think there was a DI, okay? And it's going to be interesting. So Tanner, hear me out on this. It's conjecture, high octane speculation, as some people like to say, and but it makes sense, okay? And I'll tell you what's going on with that. All right, so I'll come back to that first. So let me just keep going on. You know what? That is the last comment, so we can begin. Okay, so related to the DI and related to the magic and related to swirl. All right, so on Eddie's guitar sound, on that album, if you're sensitive to it, you can hear that his guitar sound sounds phasey. Not phase 90 phasey, right? But phasey. Like it's constantly moving and swirling in and out, right? Not something that was done with a phase 90. Something else was going on, right? Okay, so what could that be? So let's say you were to take the DI, all right? Or let's say you were to have 3 tracks. I'm just going to give you, no, let's make it 2, just for the case of for simplifying things. So let me get my paper. Okay, so now if we have 2 tracks, let's say they're identical tracks, right? I'm just going to draw something like this, and I'm going to draw something like this. Okay, so this is like track 1, and this is track 2. So this would be, let's say, Mike, and this would be DI. Okay, and these are from the same source, right? So Eddie was playing Ain't Talking About Love. One source from the mic, another source from a DI. Now what you're going to find in this is that the DI will be in a different time than the mic will be, right? And guys that are recording understand all this, that you're going to have, the tracks are not going to line up right. And that's where you start to get like the weird sort of sound of 2 sources that are out of phase with each other. So let me just show you that again, because we did this last week, but let me just show you what happens when you put an out of phase signal with the original. All right, so I'm going to go into GarageBand real quick here, and we're going to just listen to the guitar, right, as it sits. Okay, and then we're going to add in some DI. And the DI is going to be at a time, right? Because it takes a different amount of time for it to get to the same point than the mic did, right? And these are also problems when you have mics at different distances from one another, right? Because sound travels. Close ones are going to receive information before larger ones, or before longer one-ways, right? So if you have room mics, if you have a 2-mic setup with one back and one up close, or if you have a mic and a DI, you're going to have alignment problems. So let's listen to that. You remember that sound, right? Okay, so now we're going to put on the DI. You hear that immediately? Just even in the noise, right? You hear that? That's a misalignment of tracks, right? Turn that off. That was an amalgamation of and anyway, so you hear that. Okay, so back to the point. I hate going off. I'm such a scatterbrain. All right, so you've got these two tracks that are now out of sync with one another. So how are you going to get them back into sync with each other, right? Now, most of you guys that are doing recording all the time, you know that you have to delay one, right? You can't make something appear before it appears, right? So the other option is the one that arrives first to delay it, okay? So how are you going to delay this in 1978, right? You have to move these tracks, move this track, right? This track is starting a little bit before this track, so you need to delay this track a little bit, right? Now in Pro Tools, you just kind of nudge it over with your cursor and everything lines up. You'll even have software that'll line that shit up for you automatically, so you don't even have to worry about it. And we're talking about milliseconds, right? Milliseconds here. Maybe 1, 2 milliseconds, 3 milliseconds, whatever it's going to be, 5 milliseconds, whatever it's going to be. You need to line those tracks up. So one way you may do it, okay, is with 2 tape decks, right? So you may record on 2-inch tape decks or whatever and line them up a little bit differently, right, by hand. So let's say you put the DI on one tape deck, you put the mic on 2 tape decks. On the second tape deck, you combine the two and you delay one of the tape decks a little bit, right, by moving the tape head around until it lines up using only the delayed out sound. Okay, so I'm going to let me see if I can explain this to you. All right, so you're going to have one deck here and one deck here, right? So the DI is going to go into this deck, let's say, and the mic will go into this deck. Now, I'm not saying this is the way it does. I'm just using my head for high-octane speculation here. So this particular deck would come out as is, 0 ms delay, right? This deck, you would move the tape head, right, a little bit over, so it would pick up a little bit later, right? Sort of the way an Echoplex works, right? It has 2 tape heads. That's why you get a bump and then a bump, right? 1, 2, the tape heads read the tape, and as you move them further apart, you get longer delay times. As you move them closer together, you get shorter delay times. So this you would bump the tape head over, let's say 4 milliseconds, and use the delayed output only. Okay? Now, the interesting thing about this, right, is that the motors are analog, right? And they're not perfect. And the tape is not perfect, right? Tapes are not exactly the same. The gearing is not perfect. The stretch, right? All that kind of stuff. It wobbles, right? And that is going to create a point where one of the tracks is going to be shifting back and forth, relative to the first track ever so slightly, right? And that is going to create this kind of sound, right? And it's not going to be that dramatic necessarily, but that creates a kind of a phasey swirl. It's very subtle, but it's there. Another possibility of how they did this would have been with an Eventide, right? So back then we had the Eventide like the H910s. Now the interesting thing, I've got actually an old Eventide 9. Which one do I have down there? The 949, right down there on the rack. Let me move it so you can see it. Right, so it's this unit right here, right? And you can see, you obviously see it because it has the little chiclets on the bottom there. And the chiclets are what I want to talk about, right? So the interesting thing is on an Eventide like this, on the back of the unit, you have several outputs. You have a mains output, and then you have a... Anybody? Yes. A delay output only, or delay only output, right? So that what happens is whatever you put into this, only the delayed sound comes out the back, right? And on the front of it, those little chiclets, those are delay times, preset. So you've got 6 milliseconds, 12, 25, blah, blah, blah. That would be somewhat useful for lining up tracks a little bit to get the phase a little bit better, right? Now the interesting thing too is that those clocks that are in those old Eventides aren't perfect either, right? And they have glitches in them. It was like this old, CMOS system, right? The chips that they used, they were, MOSFETs. They weren't, this wasn't digital, right? This is analog computing, right? This is the very beginning of it all. So those clocks in there that are run to create the oscillators to time everything aren't perfect. Sometimes they move around a little bit, right? So that would create that kind of a weird phasey kind of sound too. So I hear that, right, in the tracks, right? So it makes me think that obviously multiple sources were put in there. Now it could be, related to the cymbals and all that, but even in the straight tracks of just the guitar, I hear a little bit of that. So it makes me think that there was multiple sources and they were far enough away where one of them could have been a DI, as opposed to another microphone. Granted, even two microphones that are off from any other will receive different information at different phase angles, but it's not so much if they're right there, the time difference isn't enough to really create a problem, right? So you're not going to need something like a 2 millisecond or 6 millisecond delay for something like that, but you would for other purposes. So, and the Eventide was available then and probably in Sunset, so maybe that was used. So, the DI thing, I'm not giving up on. I'm not yet. I mean, I appreciate that there was nothing in the diagram. But again, like I said, the world is not perfect. Records are often wrong. Memories are extremely fallible. So, and if someone says, my grandma's recipe for cookies didn't have sugar in them, because I found a recipe and there's nothing in it that says sugar, but when you make them, they taste like shit until you put sugar in them, then I'm going to say, well, grandma fucked up. She didn't put sugar in. But Tanner, I definitely respect your opinion. I definitely respect that. And, you have to continue on and not let what I say affect you, right? We all should be kind of like finding our paths on our own in a way. So if you're convinced that was the case, that there's definitely no DI involved, then that should be the way it is for you. And I would not try to challenge that. I'm just sort of giving you my speculations, right? Which are just that, speculations. All right, so we get a hit of the pink drink. So what were we going to talk about next? It was related to something here. Oh, yeah. Impedance. All right, so impedance and frequency. What's that all about? Matching, not matching. How does that all work? So that is, again, getting into some pretty heavy physics, right? And a little bit of math, but we're going to skip. We try to keep everything very 30,000 foot view conceptual and not get bogged down in minutia like equations, because I think that's ridiculous. So what we have, if you're trying to, let's say, match something to something else impedance wise, right? Like let's say you're trying to match, I don't know. All right, let's do it this way. Let's do it for cable and power transmission, as well as frequencies and power transmission through cables. Because in the end, what we're dealing with here is just wire, right? From the output transformer secondary straight through to the speakers, all the way around the voice coil and back again. That's just the length of wire, okay? And broken up into, let's say, 3 segments, right? To the speaker, around the speaker, and back from the speaker, right? Oh, you know what? 2 more. So it's the primary wind through this cable going to the speaker, around the speaker, to another cable, back to the transformer. All right, so we got 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 places, all right, where the wire is changing, right? From transformer coil wire to speaker wire, like the cable wire, to speaker coil wire, back to cable wire, and then back to transformer coil wire, all of which being different. So what's up with that, right? So how am I going to talk about this? Oh, let me get a piece of paper. I'm going to have to develop this as we're talking, so I might make a mistake or two, because it's just, I don't like to create like a presentation with a hell of a lot of research in it, because that would be too hard. I'd rather talk out of my butt. No, anyway, not really. I'd rather just go with like what hits me as important, because when it's fresh, it kind of, I think it's more interesting than when you kind of like, and then you start doubting yourself and you start going deeper and you're like, oh, well, maybe I'll talk about this instead of that. It's just ridiculous. So I'm just going to roll with what I got now. All right. So let's say you got 2 wires. Okay. You got this wire here, and then you got this wire here. All right. And this is the joint. All right. So this would be like speaker cable. SPK, let's say speak cable, and this one would be voice coil lines, right? So speaker on that side. Now what you're going to have is you're going to have power and frequencies, right, flowing down these cables, right? So let's just say it's a waveform. So let's say it looks like this, right? And then you want that to continue on, right? So you would want it to continue on nice and unabated, right? So forgive that gap. It's just imagine that these peaks and valleys are all timed equally. This would be considered like a perfect impedance match in a sense, right? Where the signal kind of has no elasticity to it. It doesn't bounce. It kind of just goes straight through, and it comes through exactly the same way. In the real world, that doesn't happen, right? In fact, let's look at something. Let's look at these, if these are different, right? This is if they're exactly the same on both sides. Let's look at it different, and we'll look at it like scalar. All right, so let's say you've got like a really thin, and then you got this. All right. All right, so now you have, let's say, a very high impedance wire going to a low impedance, right? This isn't too bad. This is going to allow for sort of a very similar energy response. Most of that signal is going to be able to find its way from the smaller tunnel into the bigger tunnel, kind of like water, right? It's going to find its way. If you go the other way, let's say like a big one. Well, actually, you know what? I'm messing that up. See, I told you I would mess that up. Let's do this. All right. So let's say we got a cable, right? This will mend, and we're going to wiggle it, right? So that's like a waveform. Now you see when I stop it, it keeps going. Right? Why is that? I'm no longer putting energy into it, yet it's going, right? And it's suspended. Let me get I got to put myself, okay, so there we go. 2 hands right into this, and I'm doing this, right? See how it's continuing to vibrate. Now, why is it doing that? Well, it's doing that basically because the frequency response, in a sense, of my arms is not going to allow that cable to vibrate me. So it's going to bounce the signal back and forth. Okay? So if you have a situation where one side, let's say, is wiggling and the other side is very difficult to wiggle, a lot of that energy is going to get smashed back. Okay? And it's not going to make through to the next stage. Right? So the waveform is going to go through like this, and it's going to hit the wall, and it's going to bounce back. And I like to, this isn't in like physics, I don't think. I don't remember hearing anything about this. But it's kind of like, I think of it as like elasticity, right? Like a wall. Like if you were to throw a ball against the wall, right? If it's a difference, in a sense, of materials, right? You're going to get bounce back. If they're exactly the same, right, the ball will fall, right? So there's energy transfer or there's energy reflection, right? So with different types of cable or different types of power handling, right, you're going to get either a consistent flow through the cable, or you're going to get some flyback, some bounce back, right? And the bounce back is going to affect sort of like the way that when I'm wiggling these things, right? If I were to just whip the thing against the wall and watch it come back, when it comes back to me, if I'm still doing that again, right? But more jerky, the waves are going to crash into each other in a sense. And there's going to be some cancellation, right? So in wire, you have all that kind of shit going on all the time, right? So if you have impedance mismatches, you're going to have certain frequencies which will go through, and certain frequencies are going to get reflected back. And then you're going to have different tones as a result of this sort of interplay between what is able to squeeze its way through the next wire or what's going to bounce back at your face, right? So that's also going to go into the amplifier itself, right? And it's going to change, in a sense, how the source is affected, right? Because the source is wiggling it, right? And if it's constantly getting resistance, let's say the way that when I'm doing this cable thing, right? And let me see. Okay. It's banging this, right? It's moving that, but it's also fighting me here, right? I could feel this. What is that saying? We're running out of disk space. Uh-oh. What time are we at here? All right, so we're at 48 minutes. So let's call it a day here, but suffice to say that there's a huge amount of variables and physics going on in there, right? In terms of how your impedance lines up one to the other, and it has a lot to do with the flow of information back and forth and reflections that come from it not being able to get through, because it's got to go somewhere. All right, so I think that's good for today. We'll talk more about this once I get more disk space, so to speak. But thank you so much for watching. And I'm going on the road for a little bit, for like 2 weeks, maybe 3. So I'm going to try to check in, but it's going to be difficult. But if I can, I'll see you out on the road. All right, so see you next.